The night was cold, and the wind moved through the quiet streets of Boston. Paul Revere stood in the shadows, watching the British soldiers. He knew what they were planning. They were coming to arrest the leaders of the rebellion and take away the weapons that the colonists had hidden. Time was running out. Revere's heart pounded as he thought about what had to be done. He could not let them take the people by surprise. He had to warn them before the soldiers marched. He moved quickly through the narrow alleys, careful not to draw attention. The city was tense. People whispered of war, but no one knew when it would begin. Revere reached the small boat waiting by the river. The moon shone over the Charles, and the water was still. Two men waited for him. Without a word, they pushed off from the shore and began to row. The sound of the oars was soft, almost like a heartbeat. Across the river, the light from the lanterns flashed. Two signals from the church tower. It was the sign that the British were coming by sea. Revere nodded. The message was clear. The ride must begin now. When he reached the other side, a horse was ready for him. The animal's breath made white clouds in the cold air. Revere took the reins and rode out fast. The sound of his horse echoed down the dirt road. He stopped at every home along the way, shouting the warning that would wake a nation. Windows opened, candles lit, and men began to move. Some ran to wake their neighbors. Others reached for their muskets. Revere did not wait to see what they did. He had no time to stop. The British were coming closer every minute. His voice cut through the night again and again, calling for people to rise. The road ahead was dark, but Revere did not slow down. His mind was clear. He thought of the people still sleeping in their homes, unaware of the danger. He thought of the dream of freedom that had brought so many to these colonies. It could all end tonight if they did not stand together. The horse galloped hard, hooves striking sparks on the stones. Then, in the distance, he saw lights, British scouts. They were searching for him. He turned down a side road, pushing the horse faster. The chase began. For miles, he rode with fear close behind, but hope burning stronger in his chest. Near dawn, he reached Lexington. Samuel Adams and John Hancock were waiting. Revere rushed to them and gave the warning. The men listened in silence, then looked at each other. The time for talk was over. Revere wanted to continue to Concord, but the British patrols caught him on the road. They surrounded him and demanded answers. He did not tell them anything. He stood proud, even as they threatened him. When they finally let him go, he knew it didn't matter. The alarm had already spread. The people were ready. As the sun rose, the first militias gathered. Farmers, shopkeepers, and young men carried old muskets and stood side by side. Bells rang in the distance. The British marched into Lexington, and the first shots of war were fired. The revolution had begun. Paul Revere had done his part. He had risked his life so that others could stand and fight for their freedom. That ride through the dark had changed everything. It showed what one man could do when he chose courage over fear. Freedom would come later, but that night, the spirit of America had already begun to rise. Paul Revere's boat reached the far side of the river. The night was silent except for the sound of the wind moving through the trees. He stepped onto the muddy bank, his boots wet, his heart steady. The horse waited for him, restless and alert. Revere mounted quickly and started his ride west toward Lexington. The road was narrow and rough, but he knew every turn. His mission was clear: to reach the leaders before the British soldiers could surprise them. The sky was dark, and every sound seemed louder in the still air. Dogs barked as he passed small farms. A few people opened their doors when they heard the horse. He did not slow down. His message was short and urgent. Once he shouted the warning, he moved on again. Time was the enemy. Every minute mattered. The soldiers were on the move, and the colonies had to be ready before dawn. As he rode farther from the river, the open land gave way to thick trees. The road curved through woods and fields. Revere listened for sounds behind him: the clatter of hooves, the ring of weapons, the steps of men. He knew the British scouts were nearby. He kept his pace fast but careful. He could not afford a mistake. His mind stayed fixed on his duty. The leaders in Lexington had to be warned. If they were captured, the rebellion could end before it began. He passed through small villages, calling out to anyone who would listen. Lights appeared in windows. Men grabbed coats and weapons, shouting for others to wake. The sound of movement spread across the countryside. Revere did not look back to see what followed. The more people who knew, the better. Each person he passed became another link in the chain of warning. The cold air stung his face as the horse galloped on. The moonlight flickered between the bare trees. He could smell the smoke of distant fires. Somewhere ahead, he saw a faint light, the first sign of Lexington. His horse was tired, but there was no time to rest. He leaned forward and urged it on. When he reached the edge of the town, two men stepped out from the shadows. They recognized him and led him to the house where Samuel Adams and John Hancock were staying. Inside, the men were waiting, tense and alert. Revere told them what he had seen, the soldiers preparing to march and the route they would take. The room fell quiet. They understood the danger. Within minutes, plans were made. Messengers were sent in every direction. The alarm was spreading fast now, beyond what one man could carry. Revere stayed only long enough to be sure the warning was understood. Then he set out again, this time toward Concord, where weapons were hidden. But he did not get far. On the road, a group of British soldiers appeared out of the darkness. They blocked his path and surrounded him. Revere stopped. He knew escape was impossible. The soldiers questioned him sharply, asking where he was going and who he had met. He refused to answer. His eyes stayed steady, his hands tight on the reins. The soldiers took his horse and forced him to walk with them for a while. When they realized the countryside was already awake and armed, they released him. Revere turned back toward Lexington, walking alone through the first light of dawn. The sky was pale blue now, and the air smelled of smoke and gunpowder. Bells were ringing in the distance. The British were coming closer, but the people were ready. The message had spread. Revere had done what he set out to do. He had carried the warning through the dark and helped light the fire of freedom that no army could stop. The first light of morning began to touch the sky as Paul Revere made his way back toward Lexington. His legs were tired, and his clothes were covered in dust, but his heart was calm. He had done what he came to do. The warning had reached the people, and now the countryside was awake. Farmers, tradesmen, and boys barely old enough to fight were readying their muskets. The quiet villages that had slept through the night were now alive with movement and purpose. Revere walked steadily, listening to the sound of distant bells calling men to gather. When he arrived back in Lexington, the streets were filled with people. Men were loading guns, sharpening tools, and speaking in low, determined voices. The fear that once filled the town had turned into resolve. No one knew exactly what would happen next, but they all knew they could not turn back. Samuel Adams and John Hancock were preparing to move farther to safety. They thanked Revere for his warning. He nodded, not with pride, but with relief. His part of the night was done, and now the weight of what was coming rested on every man's shoulders. The sound of drums and marching feet echoed in the distance. The British were on their way. The red of their coats could soon be seen between the trees as they approached the edge of town. The militiamen lined up on the village green, some trembling, some silent, all waiting for the first move. Revere stood nearby, watching, his heart heavy. He knew what was about to begin. There would be no more words or warnings, only the clash of war. The British officer shouted for the colonists to lay down their weapons. For a moment, there was stillness. Then a single shot rang out. No one knew who fired it, but that sound changed history. The soldiers opened fire, and the colonists answered. Smoke filled the air, and men fell on both sides. It was the first battle of the American Revolution. Revere watched as the people he had warned now stood against one of the strongest armies in the world. It was a terrible sight, but it was also the beginning of something greater. When the gunfire stopped, the British continued their march toward Concord. Revere followed at a distance, careful to stay out of sight. He knew that Concord held the supplies the soldiers wanted. But the warning had reached there, too. The colonists were ready. By the time the British arrived, armed men stood on the bridges, waiting. The fight flared again, louder and fiercer. This time, the British began to fall back. The tide was turning. The courage of ordinary people was beginning to shape the fate of a nation. As the day went on, Revere helped guide some of the wounded and carried messages between towns. He moved from place to place, always calm, always focused. He did not think of glory or fame. He only thought of what had to be done to keep the people united. Every man and woman he passed looked at him with gratitude, but he said little. He was just one voice among many, part of something far bigger than himself. When night fell again, the countryside was quiet once more, but it was a different silence than before. The fear that had filled the people's hearts had turned into strength. The first battle was over, but everyone knew this was only the beginning of a long fight for freedom. Paul Revere stood beneath the stars, looking toward Boston, where more soldiers waited. He thought of his family, of the men who had fallen, and of the dream that had just begun to live. He whispered to himself, almost like a promise, that freedom would not die. The sound of that vow faded into the cool night air, but the spirit behind it would live on forever. The morning after the first battles, smoke still hung over the fields. The British soldiers moved back toward Boston, tired and shaken. Along the roads, more colonial fighters appeared, coming from nearby towns. They carried old muskets, farm tools, and anything they could use as weapons. Paul Revere rode once more, this time not to warn, but to help guide men to join the fight. His voice was hoarse, his body weak, but his spirit stayed strong. Everywhere he went, he saw faces filled with both fear and hope. The people understood now that the war had truly begun. The roads were crowded with movement. Some men carried supplies, others tended to the wounded. Revere helped organize food, ammunition, and messages between the villages. He moved between towns like a bridge, keeping the colonies connected. Everyone looked to him for direction because they knew he had been there from the first night. He didn't rest much. There was no time for that. Boston was surrounded by British troops, and every hour mattered. In nearby farms, families gathered what they could to support the fighters. Women baked bread, made bandages, and melted metal to make bullets. The younger ones ran errands, carrying letters and warnings. Revere visited one home after another, thanking them quietly. He saw how ordinary people were becoming part of something far greater than they had ever imagined. The dream of liberty was no longer a whisper. It was a movement, alive and growing with every passing day. The British forces began to strengthen their positions, building defenses and waiting for reinforcements from England. Inside the city, loyalists still supported the crown, but outside, the colonies stood united. Revere worked with other patriots to gather intelligence about troop movements. He used his knowledge of Boston streets and his network of riders to keep the flow of information constant. Messages were written in code, passed through safe hands, and delivered across miles of dangerous land. Every message was a risk, but every word carried the heartbeat of a new nation being born. Weeks passed, and the tension grew. The sound of drills echoed in the fields as militias trained. The smell of gunpowder and smoke became familiar. Revere often looked toward the city from a hilltop, watching the redcoats move like ants below. He thought about how far they had come since that single night ride. Back then, it had been about warning the colonies. Now it was about protecting what had been awakened, the will to be free. He visited Lexington again, walking the same ground where blood had been spilled. The grass was marked, the fences broken, but the people were rebuilding already. They did not cry over what was lost. They prepared for what was next. Revere spoke little, but everyone who met him could see the same fire in his eyes. He believed deeply that America could stand on its own. As the summer came, more men arrived from different colonies, from New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. They brought their flags, their songs, and their courage. Together, they formed the beginnings of an army under George Washington. Revere watched the march, proud but humble. He knew that his part had only been one small piece of this great turning. The ride had been only the beginning, but it had shown the world what unity could do. One night, as he sat near a campfire, Revere listened to the sound of men talking, laughing, and planning for the future. He realized how far they had come from that night of silence and fear. The spark had become a flame. He looked up at the stars and thought about what freedom meant, not just for him, but for generations yet to come. He knew there was still a long road ahead, filled with battles and sacrifice. But he also knew something even stronger. Once a people taste liberty, they will never go back to chains. Months passed after the first battles, and the colonies were no longer the same. The quiet towns of New England had turned into centers of activity and purpose. Paul Revere continued to serve wherever he was needed. He no longer rode through the night with warnings, but he worked every day to support the cause he had helped begin. He joined meetings, printed documents, and helped organize supplies for the growing army. His silversmith shop, once a place for fine work, now became a space for making tools, metal fittings, and gun parts for the soldiers. The war had changed everything, even the simplest parts of daily life. The people were learning to live under constant threat. British ships filled the harbor, their flags waving over the water. Revere often watched them from a distance, his face calm but firm. He had seen too much to be afraid. Each day, new riders carried news from other colonies, from New York, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. The movement for independence was spreading. It was no longer just Boston's fight. It belonged to all the colonies. Revere worked closely with the local committees that helped the army. They gathered gunpowder, paper, medicine, and food. He made deliveries himself when he could. Sometimes, he traveled with small groups of men through dangerous areas, carrying letters or supplies. The roads were rough, and soldiers often patrolled them, but he was careful. His sense of direction and calm judgment kept him safe. Many young men looked up to him, knowing what he had done that first night. To them, he was a symbol of courage and duty. As the war continued, the people began to understand how long and hard it would be. Victories came slowly, and losses hit deeply. Still, Revere never doubted that the cause was right. He reminded others to stay united, to remember why they had begun. In every meeting, every conversation, he spoke with quiet strength. He told others that freedom would not come easily, but it would come if they stood together. His belief gave hope to those around him. One evening, while working in his shop, Revere received word that a new battle had been fought near Boston. The colonists had stood their ground again, and though many were lost, they did not retreat. He put down his tools and closed his eyes for a moment. He thought of the men who had fallen, of the families waiting at home. Their sacrifice, he knew, would not be forgotten. Every drop of courage added strength to the growing nation. Life in Boston was difficult under British control. Supplies were short, and many families had left. Revere stayed because his city still needed him. He worked on ways to send secret messages through trusted contacts. Some were written on thin slips of paper, hidden in barrels or beneath wagon seats. Others were spoken quietly, face to face. The risk was great, but so was the need. Without steady communication, the movement could not survive. Years passed, and the war reached beyond Massachusetts. Revere saw soldiers march away and return, some with scars, some not at all. He watched as news of the Declaration of Independence spread through the colonies. Bells rang and people cheered, their faces bright with pride and tears. It was a moment Revere had dreamed of during his long rides and sleepless nights. Yet he knew it was only another beginning. The real freedom still had to be defended. He kept working day after day, never asking for recognition. To him, freedom was not about fame or reward. It was about doing what was right, even when no one was watching. Every letter he carried, every tool he forged, every message he passed along, all of it was his way of fighting. He believed that each act of courage, no matter how small, helped build the foundation of a free nation. And though many would remember his famous ride, he knew that the true victory of America came not from one night, but from a steady, unbroken will of its people. Years of war changed everything. The colonies were no longer small, scattered settlements. They were becoming a united people, bound by the same dream of freedom. Paul Revere kept serving quietly, working wherever he was needed. The days of his midnight ride were far behind him, but his spirit had not slowed. He helped produce weapons, repaired equipment, and worked with local leaders to organize defense. His silver hands that once crafted art now shaped tools of survival. He understood that every effort, no matter how small, was part of something greater. By now, the British had lost control of many towns. The colonial army had grown stronger, more organized, and more hopeful. Revere watched with pride as farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants turned into soldiers. The struggle was far from over, but the people were no longer afraid. They had faced the worst and still stood. Revere often traveled between Boston and nearby towns to carry news and help coordinate supplies. The journey was dangerous, yet familiar. He moved through roads he had once ridden in the dark, now lit by the fires of camps and the hope of liberty. In one small village, he saw soldiers drilling in the fields. Some were barefoot, others hungry, but their eyes were steady. They trained in silence, knowing what they were fighting for. Revere walked among them, offering what little he could, a tool here, a few words there. He never spoke of himself. When people thanked him for his past ride, he only smiled and said that everyone had their part to play. To him, the fight for freedom belonged to all, not just to heroes or names remembered in stories. The war dragged on, harsh and uncertain. The winters were cruel. Many soldiers went without proper clothes or food, but they did not give up. Revere helped organize relief efforts. He gathered supplies from farms and towns, traveling through the cold to deliver them where needed. He saw the faces of mothers who had lost sons, the empty chairs at dinner tables, the quiet strength in the eyes of those who stayed behind. These moments reminded him of why the struggle mattered. Freedom was not only a word. It was a promise to every heart that had suffered. Over time, the colonies began to see signs of victory. The British army weakened, and their control slipped away. Revere heard reports of major wins in the South, of allies joining from across the ocean. The dream of an independent America was no longer distant. It was near enough to touch. Still, Revere did not celebrate too soon. He had learned that freedom required patience and faith. He kept working, forging tools, and helping writers deliver messages. Each new sunrise brought news of another step forward. Then came the day when the word spread. The war was ending. The colonies had won. The British were leaving. The streets of Boston filled with cheers and tears. Church bells rang, and flags waved from every window. Revere stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, watching the joy unfold. He thought of the long nights, the fear, the cold, and the sacrifices that had led to this moment. It had not been easy, but it had been worth everything. Later that evening, he walked along the same river he had crossed years ago. The water was calm, reflecting the light of the new nation rising around it. He thought about that night when he had rowed through silence, not knowing what would come. Now he knew. Freedom had a sound, not of war, but of peace, of children laughing, of people living without fear. Revere smiled softly. He was older now, slower, but his heart was full. He had done his duty, and his country had found its voice. As he turned toward home, the wind carried the echo of that old ride, not of warning anymore, but of promise fulfilled. Peace had finally begun to settle over the new nation. But Paul Revere's life continued with quiet purpose. The war had ended, and the United States was free. Yet the land was still healing. Towns were rebuilding, farms were being planted again, and families were trying to find normal life after years of struggle. Revere returned to his trade in Boston. His workshop, once used for tools of war, now rang again with the sound of metal being shaped into silver cups, teapots, and bells. But he was not the same man he had been before the Revolution. His eyes carried the memory of what freedom had cost. He often spoke with neighbors and young apprentices about the war years. He told them not of battles or glory, but of unity, courage, and the power of standing together. People respected him not just as a craftsman, but as a man who had served his country with quiet honor. He never boasted about his famous ride. When someone mentioned it, he smiled gently and said it had been only one part of a much larger story. For him, the true heroes were the farmers, soldiers, and families who had given everything for liberty. The country was changing fast. New laws were being written, new leaders were guiding the people, and hope filled the air. Boston was alive again. Shops reopened. Ships came into the harbor, and children played in the streets. Revere watched it all with pride. He knew this peace had been built on great sacrifice. Many who had fought were gone, but their spirit lived in every free word spoken, every flag raised high. In his later years, Revere worked on one of his proudest projects, casting a great church bell. He poured the molten metal with care, shaping it to ring strong and clear. When it was finished, and the first sound echoed through the city, people stopped and listened. The bell's deep tone rolled through the streets, a sound of peace after so much war. Revere smiled quietly. It was not the sound of warning this time. It was the sound of freedom. As he grew older, Revere spent more time with his family. His children and grandchildren loved hearing stories about the early days of the colonies, about how people stood together when the future seemed uncertain. He told them that freedom was not something that stayed strong by itself. It had to be protected with honesty, hard work, and care for one another. His voice was calm but full of truth. The young ones listened, knowing his words carried weight born from experience. Sometimes, Revere walked along the old roads he had once ridden. The towns had changed, but the memories did not fade. He could still picture the night sky, the sound of the horses' hooves, the fear, and the determination that had pushed him forward. Now, instead of silence and danger, he heard laughter and the hum of life. That was the victory he valued most. In his heart, he knew that the work of freedom was never truly finished. Each generation would face its own challenges and tests of courage. He hoped that the people would remember the lessons of the revolution, that liberty came not from power, but from unity and sacrifice. On quiet evenings, he sat by the window of his home, looking out at the city lights. The nation was still young, still learning, but it was alive and growing. Revere felt peace knowing he had played his part in its beginning. He did not see himself as a hero, only as a man who had done what needed to be done. When he closed his eyes at night, the sound of the bell he had cast seemed to echo softly in his memory, steady, strong, and free, like the country he had helped awaken. Years turned into decades, and the memory of the revolution began to fade for many. But Paul Revere never forgot the night it all began. He was now an old man, slower in step, but steady in spirit. Boston had grown and changed. New buildings lined the streets where British soldiers once marched. Children played where gunfire had once echoed. Revere often sat outside his workshop, watching the busy city with quiet pride. The people walked freely now, speaking their minds without fear. That, to him, was the truest reward of everything they had fought for. He still worked with his hands, though not as quickly as before. His silversmith business had expanded, and his sons now ran most of it. Revere had also started a new venture, a foundry that made metal bells and cannons. The same skills he had used in war were now shaping peace. He believed a strong, self-reliant nation needed men who could build, not just fight. His workshop became a symbol of that idea, a place where craftsmanship met patriotism. Many people visited him, especially young men curious about the revolution. They wanted to hear stories of the ride, of the battles, of the spirit that had built America. Revere always spoke simply. He told them that courage was not about fame or noise. It was about doing what must be done, even when no one is watching. He said that night rides and battles were only moments. What truly built a country was the character of its people afterward. Sometimes he was invited to public gatherings, where leaders spoke of liberty and independence. He would sit quietly among them, smiling faintly as he listened. The nation was no longer fragile. It had survived its first tests and was learning to stand tall. But Revere also saw new challenges rising, disagreements between states, struggles for equality, and growing debates about the future. He hoped the people would remember that their freedom had come from unity, not division. One day, while walking through the marketplace, he saw a group of school children gathered around a teacher. They were learning about the revolution. The teacher pointed toward him, and the children's eyes widened. Revere smiled shyly as they approached. A small boy asked if it was true that he had warned the people on that famous night. Revere nodded and said softly, "Yes, but remember, I was not alone. Many rode that night. Many risked everything." The boy looked thoughtful, and Revere placed a hand on his shoulder. "Freedom," he said, "is built by all of us together." That evening, Revere returned home and sat by his window. The sun was setting over the harbor, painting the water gold. Ships sailed in and out, carrying goods from a country that now traded as a free nation. He thought of the men who had not lived to see this peace, friends who had fallen, families who had lost everything. He whispered a quiet thank you to them, knowing that their courage lived on in every heartbeat of America. As darkness settled, he could hear one of his bells ringing in the distance. Its tone was deep and calm, spreading across the city. He closed his eyes and listened. To others, it was just a church bell calling people to prayer. To him, it was the voice of the past, the same voice that had called him into the night long ago, urging him to act, to believe, to ride. He knew his life was nearing its end, but he felt no sorrow. The country was strong, and its people were free. The world he had dreamed of had taken root. He smiled one last time as the bell continued to ring through the evening air, steady and clear, like the heartbeat of a nation that would never again sleep through the call of freedom. The night was quiet again in Boston, years after the war had ended. The city had grown, but the spirit of those early patriots still lived in the hearts of its people. Paul Revere had passed on, but his name and story had become a part of America's memory. Children learned about his midnight ride in school, and his story was told by fathers to sons beside warm fires on winter nights. It was more than just a tale of warning. It was a reminder of courage, duty, and love for one's country. The old roads he once rode were now busy with carriages and merchants. The lanterns that had once signaled danger now hung as peaceful lights outside homes. People no longer feared the sound of marching boots. Instead, they worked, built, and dreamed freely. Every part of Boston held a piece of that history, from the harbor where the tea was thrown to the old meeting houses where voices of liberty had first risen. It was as if the stones themselves remembered what the people had fought for. The next generation of Americans carried those lessons forward. They grew up knowing that freedom was not given easily. Teachers spoke of the men who had stood against the mightiest empire in the world, armed only with belief and courage. Paul Revere's ride became a symbol of that courage, not because he was alone, but because he represented every man and woman who chose to stand when fear said to hide. His story reminded them that one person's bravery could awaken an entire nation. As the nation expanded westward, people often took with them the spirit of that night. Settlers traveling through unknown lands remembered the struggles of their forefathers. Soldiers defending the flag in later wars thought of the midnight riders who began it all. Revere's name was spoken with respect, not for glory, but for what it meant: readiness, loyalty, and sacrifice. In time, his old home became a landmark. Visitors came from far and near to see where he had lived. They touched the walls, looked at his tools, and imagined the night when he saddled his horse and rode into danger. Guides told them how he had not hesitated, how he had trusted the people waiting for his signal, how every second had mattered. And as they stood in that quiet room, many felt a chill of pride, the kind that comes from knowing you are walking on the same ground where history once took a breath. Years passed, and the country faced new trials, wars, disagreements, changes that tested its unity. Yet, whenever Americans needed courage, they looked back. They remembered Revere's ride not as a story of fear, but of warning, of duty fulfilled without hesitation. His example reminded them that freedom required watchfulness, that someone must always be ready to act, even in the darkest hour. Even today, when people hear the words "a British are coming," they think of that night, of one man's race against time to protect his people. His ride had lasted only a few hours, but its echo has lasted for centuries. It became more than a message. It became a promise that liberty would never again be taken without a fight. And as the years go on, his story still speaks softly through the heart of America. That courage begins in the quiet moment before the leap, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, and that the call for freedom, once heard, never fades. It remains steady, bright, eternal, like the lanterns that once shone in the dark to guide a rider through the night. Long after the Revolution, the story of Paul Revere's ride became more than history. It became a lesson for every American. People remembered that one night when danger moved through the countryside, and one man chose action over fear. Families told the story to their children by candlelight, and schools included it in lessons about courage and duty. Revere's ride was no longer just a warning. It was proof that ordinary people could shape the destiny of a nation. Across Massachusetts, towns celebrated the heroes of that night. Streets were named for the riders, and markers were placed where important events had happened. Travelers would pause and imagine the clatter of hooves, the whispers of neighbors, and the hope that had spread from house to house. Every marker reminded the people that freedom had a cost, and that sacrifice was never forgotten. Even generations later, Revere's example inspired citizens to act when their country needed them. Volunteers and militias remembered the courage it took to face a powerful army, with little more than muskets and determination. Leaders spoke of his ride when urging people to unite during challenges. His story reminded everyone that freedom was fragile and had to be protected with vigilance, honesty, and cooperation. Historians wrote about him, poets sang of his courage, and artists painted the night as they imagined it. Each depiction emphasized a man riding through darkness, carrying not just a warning, but the spirit of liberty itself. His journey became a symbol that action in the face of fear could awaken the courage in others, and that even small acts could change history. Communities across New England preserved the memory of that night in ceremonies, parades, and reenactments. People dressed as riders and marched with lanterns, reminding each other that liberty is earned and maintained through bravery and unity. Visitors from other states and countries came to witness the places where the first sparks of revolution had been lit. They left understanding that freedom had not come easily, and that the people who protected it had faced real danger. Revere's life after the ride was quiet, but his influence was strong. He continued to serve his city and his country in simple ways, through his work, his guidance, and his example. Young men who saw him remembered the calm courage in his eyes, the steady determination in his hands, and the quiet way he lived his life after risking so much. They learned that heroism was not only in action, but also in integrity, perseverance, and service to others. The lanterns in the old church tower became a symbol themselves, reminding the people that light in the darkness can guide many. Revere's ride was proof that one person's resolve could shine far beyond their own vision, awakening others to courage, responsibility, and hope. Even now, when Americans hear of a time when freedom was uncertain, they recall that night. It is a story that teaches the value of action, the importance of unity, and the cost of liberty. Paul Revere's ride shows that the decisions made in a single moment can echo for centuries. It is a reminder that courage, once shown, leaves a mark that no time can erase, and that the fight for truth and freedom is always worth the risk. And so, the lesson of that night lives on, steady, clear, and unwavering, a call to every citizen that liberty demands watchfulness, courage, and the willingness to stand when it matters most.